There is a deeply unsettling phenomenon that almost every self-aware adult eventually encounters: the sudden, imperceptible shift in a room full of familiar faces. You stand among longtime colleagues, childhood friends, or family members, and while nothing explicit has transpired, the atmosphere feels distinctly altered. No arguments occurred, no insults were exchanged, and no social boundaries were visibly breached. Yet conversations sound strangely scripted. Genuine warmth is replaced by polite restraint, and laughter arrives a beat too late. Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung identified this silent chill not as accidental misunderstanding, but as a predictable psychological reaction. When an individual undergoes internal growth or heightens self-awareness, their mere presence begins acting as a mirror to those around them. The hostility emerging in these quiet moments is rarely triggered by what one has done wrong. Rather, it is ignited by the invisible discomfort that one's presence unconsciously exposes in others. To comprehend this irrational social hostility, one must examine the foundational framework of Jungian psychology, the structural tension between the persona and the shadow. Derived from the Latin word for a theatrical mask, the persona represents the curated, socially acceptable identity an individual constructs to navigate public life. Beneath this protective shield lies the shadow, the vast reservoir of the unconscious mind, where every rejected impulse, buried insecurity, denied anger, and unacknowledged ambition is deposited. The shadow is not intrinsically malicious. It is simply the untamed totality of everything an individual deemed too dangerous or unacceptable to integrate into their public self-image. Because maintaining a rigid persona requires enormous psychological energy. Any external element threatening to puncture this mask and expose repressed contents beneath will be met with immediate, instinctive resistance from the threatened individual. When an individual refines their self-awareness and sheds their own psychological illusions, they naturally stop participating in the tacit social scripts that sustain the personas of others. This unstated refusal triggers a powerful, automated defense mechanism known as projection. Unable to process the internal discomfort sparked by an emotionally grounded person, the fragile ego projects its unacknowledged flaws onto the observer. Rather than asking why another person's quiet composure induces anxiety, the threatened mind reframes the dynamic entirely to protect its own self-image. The honest observer is suddenly labeled arrogant, distant, or judgmental. Through projection, the internal conflict is externalized. The burden of self-examination is neatly displaced, transforming an internal psychological failure into an external grievance against an innocent target who has done nothing more than simply refuse to participate in collective self-deception. Perceptiveness alone, even when accompanied by kindness and discretion, is often perceived as a direct threat by those invested in self-deception. An individual who has spent years perfecting a public performance relies entirely on the passive compliance of their audience. When someone enters the room possessing the emotional clarity to see past the performance, who does not validate false modesty or flatter ego-driven displays, the social illusion collapses entirely. The observant individual does not need to utter a single word of criticism. Their calm neutrality and refusal to engage in performance art act as a silent audit of the room. To an ego sustained by illusion, being truly seen without the protection of the persona feels equivalent to absolute vulnerability. This explains why the most perceptive people in any room frequently become the most quietly resented, despite having caused no visible harm whatsoever. 7 distinct behavioral shifts consistently provoke this unconscious social hostility. The first occurs when personal growth quietly reflects another person's systemic avoidance. When an individual elevates their standards, whether by improving physical health, mastering finances, or establishing emotional regulation, silent self-discipline carries an inescapable communicative weight. In social circles accustomed to collective stagnation, one person's commitment to self-improvement inadvertently acts as a live demonstration of what is genuinely possible. The excuses group members previously used to rationalize their own passivity begin losing validity. Consequently, the individual pursuing discipline is often met with sharp sarcasm, dismissive remarks, or backhanded compliments specifically designed to minimize their progress and restore the comfortable baseline of shared neglect that previously defined the group's collective identity and kept everyone feeling equally justified in their inaction. Resentment within social hierarchies almost never flows toward those who are struggling. It flows toward those who embody abandoned possibilities. When a person breaks away from a soul-crushing routine, leaves a toxic relationship, or pursues an authentic craft, they become an involuntary indictment of those who chose security over fulfillment. To validate the courageous choices of the growing individual would require acknowledging one's own self-betrayal. To evade this painful realization, the observer minimizes the achiever's efforts, attributing their success to raw luck or privilege. A third catalyst is the withdrawal of the need for external approval. When an individual undergoes personal development, they naturally stop seeking validation and cease over-explaining their decisions. This newfound psychological autonomy permanently alters group dynamics. The leverage others once exercised through subtle guilt or conditional praise suddenly ceases to function, generating immediate hostility rooted in the sudden loss of relational control. Unconscious social dynamics depend heavily on predictable behavioral scripts. Everyday manipulation relies on reliable cause and effect loops. A subtle jab yields an immediate apology, and a guilt trip triggers overcompensation. When a self-aware individual breaks these patterns by responding with calm neutrality or complete non-engagement, the manipulative system short-circuits entirely. Because those who rely on covert social control cannot operate in an environment of transparency. Their discomfort quickly manifests as coldness or exclusion. Every long-standing social circle also operates on unwritten agreements, comfortable fictions, allowing unhealthy behaviors to persist unchallenged. When a maturing individual quietly revokes their consent by refusing to laugh at malicious jokes or validate dishonest narratives, they break the collective spell. Groups defend their structural illusions aggressively, casting the non-compliant member as a troublemaker, destroying the peace, when in reality they have simply pointed out that the emperor has no clothes. The implementation of firm, healthy boundaries represents one of the most volatile disruptions in established relationships. For years, an individual may have functioned as the default emotional sponge, always available and willing to absorb mistreatment to preserve harmony. When that individual begins establishing clear boundaries by saying an unapologetic no and protecting their mental bandwidth, those who benefited most will frame this self-respect as sudden selfishness or cold detachment. The seventh trigger is the natural divergence occurring when one person moves forward while others remain stagnant. As the cognitive gap expands, common ground inevitably evaporates. Because facing one's own lack of growth causes immense internal pain. The mind converts that discomfort into resentment. Jung defined the ultimate objective of psychological maturity as individuation, the arduous process by which an individual integrates the conscious self with the unconscious shadow, sheds the tyranny of the persona, and steps into authentic wholeness. The primary reason an individuating person causes deep existential anxiety in unexamined social structures is that they become functionally impossible to control. An individual who has integrated their shadow and freed themselves from the absolute need for external validation cannot be swayed by standard social currencies. They cannot be bribed with superficial status, intimidated by subtle ostracization, or manipulated through artificial guilt. In any institution, workplace, or family network that relies on compliance to maintain order, an uncontrollable person is viewed as a systemic hazard. Their independence demonstrates to others that submission to the collective identity is a choice rather than an absolute necessity, shaking the very foundations of the group's authority. This is precisely why the most psychologically mature individuals in any environment frequently find themselves quietly marginalized, not because they have failed, but because their freedom exposes everyone else's invisible chains. Upon realizing that one's growth is generating quiet hostility, the natural human impulse is either to retaliate defensively or to shrink back down to restore peace. Both reactions are psychological traps. Retaliating with intellectual superiority or moral condescension validates the group's negative projections, transforming a subtle dynamic into open warfare. Conversely, making oneself smaller, sanding down one's edges, playing dumb, or re-engaging in toxic habits to put others at ease is an act of self-mutilation. Suppressing one's light to accommodate someone else's darkness does not cure their insecurity. It merely surrenders the progress achieved through hard-won self-awareness, trapping both parties in a cycle of dishonesty. The only viable path forward requires neither aggression nor retreat, but rather a grounded, unwavering commitment to remaining exactly who one has worked so diligently and courageously to become. Navigating this complex terrain requires developing precise emotional discernment. It is vital to distinguish between constructive criticism from people who genuinely care about our well-being and the reactionary hostility generated by someone else's shadow. Genuine feedback is specific, actionable, and delivered with the intent to build up rather than tear down. Shadow projection, by contrast, is characterized by vague accusations, passive-aggressive hostility, and a distinct satisfaction in seeing the target stumble. A crucial warning within Jungian psychology is that no individual is entirely exempt from the mechanics of projection. It is dangerously easy to adopt a new, sophisticated persona, the enlightened observer or the misunderstood seeker, and begin viewing everyone else as psychologically primitive. True psychological maturity is marked not by smug superiority, but by quiet, grounded humility, and the relentless willingness to examine one's own shadow with the same unflinching honesty applied to others. As an individual remains committed to self-awareness, authentic boundaries, and shadow integration, an inevitable realignment of their social landscape takes place. Relationships built purely on shared dysfunction or convenient compliance will naturally wither and dissolve. This shedding process is painful, often accompanied by genuine grief, as it frequently involves people who were once central to one's life. However, this clearance is a necessary prerequisite for higher quality connections grounded in mutual respect and authentic recognition. Ultimately, the journey of psychological growth requires making peace with the reality of being an accidental mirror. When the chill enters the room and subtle hostility arises without cause, the individuating person learns to stop flinching. They realize that the cold shoulder and the unspoken rejection are not verdicts on their worth, but silent testaments to the extraordinary and undeniable power of a life lived with clarity, discipline, and uncompromising emotional integrity.